Hey everyone, welcome back to the Navigating History podcast. This is Season 1, Episode 7, and this week we're going to cover Alexander the Great and his campaign against the Mallian tribe of the Indian subcontinent. Before I get into today's topic, though, I just want to say thank you very much for all the support that's been coming in on all the different platforms, whether it's Instagram, Spotify, TikTok, or YouTube. Thank you so much for all the support on all of the episodes. I really appreciate it, and I hope you guys are enjoying the content, and I look forward to producing more content for you in the future as well. Anyway, let's just jump right into this week's episode, shall we? So a little bit of background on what has happened up until this point, because it is important for what happens in this week. So it had been now 8 years, 8 years since the Macedonians had crossed the Hellespont River and attacked the Persian Empire. With battle and starting with the Battle of the Granicus River in 334 BCE. So the Persian army was the Persian army after defeating the Persian army, the Macedonians were very tired, right? And they were like I talked about last week, a little bit before the campaign into India. They were tired. They wanted to go home. They weren't sure what was happening. They figured, all right, we've done what we set out to do. Now let's go home and rest. And Alexander had this insatiable lust for conquest. He wanted to be the ruler of everything in the world. In fact, the Greeks at this point had this idea that just beyond the Indian subcontinent was the ocean that surrounded the continent that was the entire world. Obviously, as modern people, we understand this wasn't true, but for them, this was true. And Alexander wanted to be the conqueror of it all. He wanted to be the conqueror of everything. And Alexander's men didn't really share his ambition. So after the battle at the Hydaspes River, Alexander spent about a month or so sort of consolidating his power in the region, him naming vassals, and including King Porus from the last episode, and sort of maintaining control over the region. And then he set out on campaign deeper, further east and deeper into uncharted territory. In fact, it got so bad and Alexander's army were known for campaigning throughout all of the seasons. So not just the normal campaigning season, from say April through to October, say, but through the entire year. So in Greece, this meant winter, but here in India, this meant the monsoon season. So this was terrible weather for them to be marching in. It's just long days, with exhausted, already worn down and battle weary troops who don't want to be there. And eventually, it got to the point where Alexander's army mutinied. Right. I'm gonna butcher this pronunciation, so I apologize. The Hephaestus River. Alexander's army mutinied. They basically said, we will not go any further. We're not doing this. Alexander had this ambition for conquest, right? As I've talked about, he had this grand ambition of conquest, and the rest of his army was kind of like, no, we want to go home. We're done here. We don't want to do this, right? And Alexander initially was enraged by their lack of ambition. He was enraged by the fact that these people did not want to do things. But then, being the super religious person that he was, he sort of paid attention to what was going on. For them, the eclipse was bad, and apparently there were some other quote unquote bad omens that he pointed to, and sort of turned this into a win for him. Initially, right, he was like I said, he was initially angry, but then it's sort of unclear. The historical sources are somewhat unclear as to whether or not he knew that this was going to happen and was waiting to end at an opportune moment, and to try and save face with his army, or whether or not he was genuinely angry, or genuinely outraged. But he was upset. Obviously, he did want to conquer the rest of the world, but he sort of realized, okay, eventually, after a long sort of feeling out process and conversations with his generals, he sort of realized, okay, yeah, this is probably for the best, and we're gonna go home. But he decided that, all right, we're gonna go home. We're gonna head home, but we're not gonna do so through the already established path that we've taken previously, that we've just basically gone on for the last 8 years. We're going to go through a different way to make it seem for historians that we didn't basically go home and just surrender. So Alexander, instead of heading back west immediately, he first headed south through the Indian subcontinent and then west. So he was focusing on heading back in a different direction than they'd come, in order to sort of, again, try and save face as a conqueror. And this was a big blow to Alexander's ego. This was something that he really didn't he didn't really want to do, but he sort of realized that was necessary. And because Alexander had this vision of himself, right? Alexander's entire adult life, he's still a relatively young man at this point. He's about 20, 28, 29 years old by this time. His entire adult life, say even so when starting at age of 16, has been a string of nothing but success, no failures. Pretty much nothing has gone wrong for him his entire adult life. And this, coupled with what I talked about last week, with his journey to the Oracle of Delphi and the sort of the prophecy that he was given, and the way that the Oracle spoke about him, he believed that he was blessed by the gods and favored and had godlike abilities. He sort of saw himself as a semi-deity, genuinely like a demigod. He sort of saw himself that way. Thought that he was unkillable and completely infallible, and was going to be, but basically he had a divine mission. Basically, he was a very devout religious person, and the fact that he wasn't able to carry out what he believed to be his religious mission was to conquer. Really weighed heavily on him, and was a massive blow to his ego. But he sort of understood, okay, this is something that I need to do. Otherwise my men are going to hate me forever, and all of the other conquests that I've made are for nothing if we die here. Pretty much is basically sort of what he said, and he's not wrong. So again, Alexander's on that march southwest, still through India at this point, and taking a different route than he had before. They entered the territory of the Mallian tribe, and at this point, Alexander, he was like, okay, great. Now these people, the Mallians, had resisted, had banded together with another tribe to resist Alexander and the Macedonian advance, and stop them from marching through their lands, basically stopped them from entering their territory, and stopped them from trying to attack. Basically tried to stop them from advancing further. And at this point, most of the Macedonian soldiers were just trying to get home, but Alexander saw this as an opportunity to prove that the Macedonian war machine was still one of, if not the most elite fighting force in all of the world at this point. And he decided to launch a campaign against the Mallians, sort of on his way home. Also, he realized that, if he didn't they were going to attack regardless of what he did. So he needed to defend himself and do something about it. So initially, they're following the Hydaspes River, right? They're following it into Malian territory, and Alexander does something, again, being a tactical and military genius that he is. He divides his army into 3 smaller forces, keeping close to each other so that they couldn't be outmaneuvered or overrun, or completely, outflanked, and stripped of resources, right? He kept his supply chain relatively close, close to him as well there. But what they did was he tore off into the countryside, right? Gathering resources, and also just destroying the Malian people. So this is something that happens a lot in history. History is never history is never easy to cover. It's not. It's to me, I find it interesting to cover and I enjoy covering it, but it's not, again, like I said in previous episodes, Alexander was not, there are no good guys in history, right? There's just, this is what happened and this is what the people did, because Alexander massacred the Mallian people. He put them to the sword, not just military combatants, but men, women, children, doesn't matter. He wanted to sow fear. He wanted to sow fear in this case, and he wanted to make it seem as though he wanted to make the Macedonians feared in the region, and of course that obviously had the desired effect. And he was funneling the Mallians to their capital to sort of lay siege to it and then to take it over. In fact, the first phase of the battle, Alexander rushed to prevent the Mallians from engaging with their allies. In fact, the way that this ended up working was that his allies, the Mallians, had allied themselves with the tribe that was their mortal enemy. They had allied themselves. Alexander made the Mallians ally with a tribe that had been their sworn enemy, a tribe that had been their mortal enemies for generations, and at this point they had set aside their differences to try and come together. To try and like fight this Macedonian threat, this new threat that was invading their territory. And this battle sort of takes place over 3 phases, right? So the first phase of the battle, Alexander rushes to intercept and then sows his reign of terror, which, I mean, goes well for him, and he sort of it works out well for him. And he starts winning, and the Mallians are afraid, but they're also fleeing. And he surrounds several cities and says, "Okay, don't actually besiege the city, but let people like sort of surround them and corral them and stop them, but don't like put the city to the sword yet. I want to be there." And this is another thing that Alexander did throughout all of his campaigns, was he made sure that everything was done. Everything important he did himself. All of the important stuff he really wanted to do himself. This was something, anything that he deemed extremely important, he was the one who always was in charge, and he made all of the major important decisions himself rather than leaving it to his generals at this point. And that's why I think a little bit of why Parmenion didn't get a lot of love from him, and why I wanted to shed a little bit of light on him last episode, but because Alexander made all of the most important decisions himself. Although, yes, he did have counsel from his generals, and they were important, Alexander was the be-all and end-all, and was always the one leading campaigns. Like with the Roman Empire, you have people who, the emperor wasn't always the one leading the campaign. Alexander was always the one leading, always from the front, always there, and always wanted to be the one in charge of making military decisions. Right, so Alexander basically destroyed towns and cities and massacred the Mallian people in order to send a message that the Macedonians were still a major player in the area. And despite the fact that they were, again, this was also to his mind as well, because for him, he was, right, like I said, Alexander had taken that ego, a shot to his ego, with the attack, or with the mutiny of his army, and the fact that he couldn't advance his campaign in the way that he had initially planned. So he wanted to sort of prove to himself as well as his men that, okay, yeah, we're still kind of badasses here. We're still important, and we're still a dominant military force both in this region but also in the world. And of course this was the case. And Alexander sort of again, he wanted to send this message both to himself and to his men, as well as the rest of the world. this in the second phase of the army. So after this first phase has kicked off, and Alexander's campaign against the Mallians had kicked off with varying success, the the alliances between the Mallians and the other tribe I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of if I tried it, so I'm just not even going to bother. I apologize, but I will absolutely butcher the pronunciation, so I won't get to it. The alliance began to break down because they couldn't decide which tribal leader would be in charge. They couldn't decide who was going to lead, and Alexander was able to surprise them. Alexander was able to catch them off guard because, like I mentioned earlier, he was able to campaign during multiple campaigning seasons, or during every season, so that there was no quote-unquote campaigning season and an off season. It was just we're on the march. When we're campaigning, it's campaigning season. When we're not, it's not, rather than making it weather dependent. And this made them think that the Mallians and their allies thought that they had more time. Right, they thought that they would have more time to defend themselves against Alexander's attacks, and they thought that they would have more time to. They thought that they would have more time to prepare for the Macedonian army initially, and in fact, Alexander was able to surprise a large number of the Mallian force outside one of their major cities, but not their capital city, and absolutely massacre them because they weren't expecting they weren't expecting an attack, and those who he didn't massacre actually fled into the city. And again, this is one of the examples where he said, "Hey, don't actually besiege the city; just surround it, let them survive until I get there, and then." Because he was then off doing something else, and his army attacked, and then he came back to the city, and once he was there, they broke the garrison of over 2,000 men, killed every single one of them, and then set the city aflame. And really, again, this was one of the most brutal campaigns in history, especially in Alexander's reign, because there was no. At this point, he wasn't trying to conquer the land to rule it. He was just trying to conquer it to win. He wasn't trying to install vassals in this area, right? Like he did with Persia or with Porus. He wasn't trying to install vassals. He wasn't trying to set up chains of command or the administrative side of the army. He was just purely on the warpath, and that's what makes him so dangerous. Because normally, on the other campaigns that we've covered here on this season, he was holding back a little bit in terms of his fight, and he was trying to he was looking for the forwards towards the administrative side of actually running an empire. And here he's just killing everyone to try and get home, and it's devastating, genuinely, to cover this, because you see the numbers of and I won't get into them, but thousands and thousands of people who just were in the wrong place at the wrong time and ended up being killed by this bloodthirsty conqueror, which is what Alexander was. As great a figure from history that he is, he was genuinely, a ruthless military commander who had no qualms about putting populations to the sword. In fact, he was able to, again, and his entire plan for this campaign was to funnel all of the Mallian people, like refugees, again, men, women, children, military members, it doesn't matter. He was attempting to funnel them to the capital city so that he could then besiege it and take it over. In fact, after this particular siege, where he was able to siege and burn the city, a small section of the army was able to flee, and Alexander pursued them. He pursued them, and they were able to meet up with a larger force of refugees, and able to pursue them to the banks of the. Again, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, so I apologize. Hydroatis River, to the Hydroatis River, and they basically set up for a fight on the high ground and offered to fight him, basically, even but high above the river, and offered to fight him and said, like, okay, like, let's freaking end this, right? They were trying to end this, either win or lose. And Alexander, being a somewhat reckless military commander that he was, he just crossed the river, basically disregarded anything that they want. And this is sort of one of my favorite things to cover with Alexander, is the fact that any time he's coming up against an opposing force and they try and set the terms of the battle, he's just like, nope, it's gonna be my way, or you're like, it's not happening. You're either gonna fight me on my terms the way I want, or it's not happening. And it's a very, very, very everything is done the way that he wants it done, and everything is on his terms, and he never fights on somebody else's terms if he can help it. If you look at any of his campaigns against Darius and the Persians, it's like that as well. Everything is done the way that he wants it done. Everything happens the way he wants it to. Everything, like, for example, you even have like the battles where Darius had tried to set the field into his advantage, and Alexander changes the battle so that everything is on his terms. Even if the field isn't on his terms, the scenario in which the battle takes place will be on his terms, and the way that things happen will be on his terms. And that's a big thing for him as well. So of course Alexander pursues them, and the Mali flee, because at this point the terror of the Greeks had far outweighed the actual size of Alexander's army. The absolute carnage that he was able to sow at this point, the way he was able to handle things, the way he was able to sow this doubt and this fear and this genuine terror in a larger force with a smaller force, is military mastery. It's one of the greatest tactics that we've ever seen, because he was able to, the Mallians had over 90,000 infantry infantrymen, and over 10,000 horses, and over 900 chariots as well, in terms of their numbers as a standing army. That excludes people that in local garrisons or farmers that could have held spears at one point if they'd been trained. This is what their standing army was. And Alexander definitely had roughly 50,000 or so men at this point, and they were able to completely dominate the region with very few casualties on the side of the Macedonians, because of this fear factor that Alexander swept forth with, and the fact that he was able to control all of the battlefields, and he was able to control the territory, even though it was foreign territory, and even though the Mallians, it was their home turf. He was able to control everything with the way he wanted things done. He was able to make it so that everything was on his, like I said, everything is on his terms. Everything is done the way he wants it to, and everything goes through him. And if you're going to resist him, it's going to be hard for you, because he controls as many factors as possible, and he controls more and more and more and more and more. The more factors he controls, the less likely, obviously, the Mallians were to win, of course. But he was able to control everything in this campaign. He was it wasn't just the Mallians were fighting a defensive war, but they were on the defensive from the get-go, right? They were obviously defending their homeland, but they were on the defensive immediately. They were always backpedaling in every fight, every siege, every sort of fake engagement. And Alexander never really had a standing engagement until the end. That's one of the things that he wanted to do with this campaign, was never have a genuine standing engagement, a pitched battle, like he did against Darius several times. He did not have time for this. He didn't have time to, lay the groundwork right. He was trying, like I said, the Macedonians at this point, they were trying to go home. They just wanted to go home through a different route. And so Alexander didn't have time for a super pitched battle until he was sure he was going to win, and it was going to be extremely decisive. And that's what he was aiming for by funneling the Mallians towards their capital, was I'm going to put all of you in one spot and all of our army versus all of you guys, and then we're going to fight. This isn't going to be a long, super drawn out campaign like we had against the Persians. No, there's going to be one decisive battle, and that's going to be it. And that's what Alexander's goal was here. He wanted one decisive moment of conquest. He wanted one decisive fight that would decide everything. And this is what happened. Is the Mallians fled to their capital, which was at this time known as the city of the Mallians, to the Persians, or to the Macedonians and the Persians as well. So Alexander didn't really know what the name of the capital was, and my historical sources that I've found didn't have a specific name for it other than the city of the Mallians. So if there is a name out there that I don't know, I do apologize for not having it. And then eventually they did lay a full siege on the city. It was actually on an island, and they were able to besiege it in the middle of a river, and they lay siege to it. Eventually, they broke down the outer walls and stormed into the city, but the Mallians were able to hold up inside their citadel, inside their fortified castle, basically. And Alexander was very, very, very much. He was very impatient with the way that the siege was going. And like I've mentioned in several podcasts in this season, if you haven't watched or listened to any of the other episodes, I highly recommend you check them out. But he's an extremely reckless commander sometimes. He has these moments of recklessness that an older commander, someone like a Julius Caesar, probably would not have had. Somebody with an older head probably would not have had. Somebody with a more... Alexander was a brilliant tactician, but somebody with a more analytical mind instead of almost an emotional mind when it comes to battle probably would not have had the same sort of mindset as Alexander when he was entering these battles. And that's not to say that commanders like Julius Caesar didn't fight alongside their men and on the front lines of conflict, because of course there are moments when people like Julius Caesar would do that, and there are moments especially where Caesar would do that for sure. But there are always those moments in someone in history that, again, that could have gone horribly for one person, but because of either dumb luck or just pure whatever, maybe you can even call it divine intervention, what have you, at least that's what Alexander would call it, things went his way. For example, he took a siege ladder himself with only two or three bodyguards and charged up onto the walls of the citadel and began fighting himself. And the Macedonians at this point were extremely freaked out because their king, the linchpin holding this entire massive empire together, the linchpin holding this entire empire together, was fighting basically alone, unprotected on the walls against a severely he was severely outnumbered against a much larger force of Mallians at this point. And he's fighting on the walls himself with a much larger force there. And in fact, this was a devastating battle for Alexander personally. This was the final battle, of course. This is of this campaign, and this was a devastating battle for Alexander personally because he, while he was on this wall, he ended up actually taking an arrow to the chest and having to be dragged back by his men, and his health was touch and go for weeks and months, and they had to actually make a specific small incision into his chest to try and remove the arrow without damaging the rest of his body and sort of trying to preserve his life because of the way that the arrow had pierced his lung. Alexander wasn't being able to get air into his lungs to breathe. Right? Because sometimes if you get hit with an arrow, like you get hit in the shoulder, it sucks, but you'll eventually recover and it's not life-threatening. But this was the most damaging and most life-threatening injury that Alexander ever sustained on the battlefield. This was the worst battle that he had up until this point in his life. As I mentioned, his entire adult life up to this point, basically uh, 12 or so plus years, depending on when you classify somebody as an adult. If we say 18, which is the modern standard, say, the last 10 years of his life, everything has been one swift, relatively swift at least, conquest and victory after the other. And now he's still in the prime of his life, right? At this point, he's 28, 29 years old. He is fighting for his life with a wound that nobody thought that Alexander could sustain, whether it was him, Alexander himself, or his men. They started to, like I've mentioned in previous episodes as well, they started believing him to be this godlike figure that he believed himself to be, and the fact that he always won. The fact that even when they sort of lost, right, if you talk about the Battle of the Persian Gate, where they sort of lost initially, but then found a way to win, or they were losing the battle initially and they found a way to win. You have, whether it's Guacamela or Issus, where they were losing initially and they found a way to win, right? Alexander's forces never, ever, ever lost, and Alexander himself never lost. Alexander himself was never defeated. Alexander himself was never really, really, really hurt. I mean, of course, like I talked about in the first episode of this season, the Battle of the Granicus River, there were several instances that had things gone slightly differently, it could have been really bad. But genuinely, Alexander never lost. He never got severely hurt. He never got injured. He never, yes, it was risky, and there were some moments where, you don't know what's going to happen, but right, but it was never anything like this. This was the first time that his life was, after a battle was over, his life was in serious, serious danger. Even though eventually the Macedonians were able to break into the capital, the citadel, and burn it with over 5,000 Mallian citizens inside, not just soldiers, but citizens. They were able to burn it. And they ended up winning on the campaign. The biggest threat for them was Alexander's life. The fact that Alexander himself his life was in danger. And in fact, they were crossing river after river, and along the coast they wouldn't even row the boats because they were worried that the rocking of the boats would disturb his surgery. And like I said, this incision had to be made, and for several hours after the battle, his generals sort of stood around going, what do we do, right? Who wants to be, like, because nobody wanted to, nobody wanted to be the person that possibly killed Alexander if this went badly, because it was an extremely risky procedure that needed to happen in order to save his life, right? It was an extremely risky time, and they're thinking, okay, who's going to be the one? Finally, somebody eventually stepped up and said, all right, I'll do it, because if they didn't do it, he was going to die, but there was a chance that he could still die regardless. Luckily for Alexander, the surgery did go well. The surgery did work, and he was able to, the life-threatening side of his injuries were over, but this was the start of the decline for Alexander and his forces, right? This is Alexander sort of starting to decline. For those of you who don't know, spoiler alert for all of history, I guess, but Alexander died at the age of 33. Alexander is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant and most influential military tacticians and influential figures throughout all of history, right? Like I mentioned in a previous episode, I believe it was episode 5 or 4, I can't remember which one. I said, if you go up to somebody on the street and say, have you heard the name Alexander the Great? They will probably have said yes. They'll probably say, yes, I've heard the name before. Even if they don't know much about him or much of who he was or who he is, or what his myth is, they will have at least heard the name. Or, they go, oh yeah, that sounds kind of vaguely familiar, right? He's that famous, and he only lived to be 33 years old. So just shows you how influential and impactful this campaign, specifically his campaigns against the Persians, were, because, and then and then on the Indian subcontinent. But Alexander was reckless, and it cost him his life. I'll get to this next week, but Alexander Alexander's recklessness, while it served him well for the majority of his military campaign, his recklessness with his army, caused a mutiny. Like I talked about at the beginning of this episode, it caused a mutiny there, and he was unable to. He basically had to turn around and go, all right, guys, you're right, I fine. So he didn't get killed by his own men because they were fed up with the fact that he was driving them to another conquest when they believed that they had absolutely no right to be there. But Alexander genuinely, it really, really, really was one of these. This was the moment where Alexander's his luck started to run out. Right, I talk about Alexander. I talked about in the first episode of this series. I talked about Alexander being extremely lucky at the Battle of the Granicus River. Right, I talked about how a sword clanged off the back of his head, and in the middle of battle, it bit into his helmet and cleaved part of his helmet. If it gone deeper, he would have had his head cut off. But it didn't, and he was lucky. So this is the start of his luck starting to run out. And Alexander, like I mentioned earlier in this episode, he viewed himself as this godlike creature who could not be defeated, godlike deity almost, who couldn't be defeated. Whereas in truth, he genuinely was just a very lucky and very skilled mortal man. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this week's episode. If you're listening to this on Spotify, thank you again. Thank you as well for listening or watching this week's episode. If you haven't already, follow at Navigating History on Instagram. Follow at Navigating_history on TikTok. Like I mentioned, we'll be doing a lot more on TikTok and on Instagram in the coming weeks. So stay tuned there. And please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube for weekly uploads on every Sunday. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your Halloween weekend.